Kala focused a lot on what's happening at the city level. I'll sort of just zoom up right to what's happening in terms of the form of urbanization. How exactly is urbanization taking place? And fundamentally, I'll posit that there are two ways of thinking about it. Traditionally, you think of urbanization as people moving from villages to cities. Migration is the big story of urbanization. And so whenever you think of urbanization, you think of migration. But there is another way in which urbanization can and does take place in India, which is that the character of the settlement changes. So in India, we define urbanization, and I'll sort of zip across to that in a second, by three characteristics, which is what most people here know, which is a size of 5,000, density of more than 400 square kilometer, and most importantly, that 3/4 of the male workforce, and I don't think there is a gender issue there. I'm happy to get back to it if people want to explore that. But the 3/4 of the male workforce engaged in non-farm activities. And so if a settlement tips over these characters, then the place becomes urban. So you can basically be urban without moving. And the question is, what is the weight of these two factors? Is it about movement of people, or is it about morphing of places? And what I'll argue today is that in India, the morphing of place is as much, if not more, an issue, a factor in the whole urbanization process than the movement of people, and which has specific implications for how and where urbanization takes place in India. The way we, there we are. This is roughly the plan of the presentation, and I'll zip through most of it pretty quickly. I hope I won't exceed the time. The first question, and this sort of goes back to a question which we've asked and answered sort of sporadically in the morning, which is how urban is India? And this slide sort of runs you through the evolution of the definition of urbanization right from day one to 1881, which is when we started counting, to what it is today. And you will find that way back in 1881, you had the conceptual components of this process in place. I must say that both Professor Kundu and Professor Mathur will most probably glaze over at this point in time, because they've seen this presentation once before and they're wondering what the hell is it doing sitting here now. I'm just hoping that they have as a result of being familiar with this presentation earlier, they'll be nicely combative when it comes to the question sessions. It says the collection of numerous dwellings near each other, which is essentially density, and having shops which provide a continual open market, which is about non-farm activities. So if you think about it, both those sort of components have been there conceptually since 1881. How you measure it quantitatively is something that has evolved over time. And in 1961, we came upon the definition that we currently have. And this is the thing that Professor Shiv Ramakrishnan was mentioning in the morning, that our definition of urban is actually absolutely unique. There is no other country in the world that actually defines urban in the way we do. There are 6 other countries which uses this economic definition, but only we use all 3 components. Right, so we are specific in a special way. Now, what does this mean in terms of the settlement structure for India? So this actually is work that's been done by my colleague Kanu Pradhan, and what he's done is he's taken these 600,000 settlements and grouped them into these 3 little graphs that you see, Venn diagram that you see, and you see all towns is like out there, which sort of meet all these 3 criteria, which are essentially the ones in the middle, which meet all 3 criteria. I'm just separating them out because of a particular story. And all villages are the ones which don't meet any of those criteria. I'm sorry, the villages not satisfying any criteria, about 313 million, 313,000 villages of about 263 million people living in them. That's which are completely, definitely, utterly villages. They don't meet any of the 3 criteria of urbanization that we mentioned. And what you see here is that a lot of our villages are very dense. And since I'm speaking to a partly American audience, which is why you have a density per square mile, just to make you feel comfortable and at home. So you have the structure in place, which is roughly about 260 million people, a purely just density per square mile, and you add in another 90, and that's another, a pretty almost 400 million people which meet the density criteria. So people in our villages, remember this is not just the Abadi area. This is the revenue village, which means it includes lands, etc. So we have a pretty bunch of, about 400 million people living in pretty dense settlements in that sense. And then you will find that the male non-agricultural workforce, that crossing that criteria is the hardest. As you see, that has the least number in that kind of space, and then there is a population size which sort of puts together. One of the things I'll point out to you is that a village doesn't have to be large in order to be dense. And that's a part that sort of is useful for us to remember. What I would like you to notice is the way the census operates is that the census frame for what is urban and what is rural gets decided about 2 years before the census is actually implemented. So it got decided in 1999 for the 2001 census. It got decided in 2009 for the 2011 census. And at that point, they decide which settlements are urban and which settlements are rural, because they administer two different schedules. Ex post, you can actually calculate how many of those settlements meet the urban criteria. And as it happens, in 2001, there were another 32 million people who should have been classified as urban, but were not. And remember, the 2001 urban population is about 287 million. So this is an additional 13%, which is about an additional 2% of the population that you're looking at, which is essentially more than 2%, about 3% of the population that you're looking at, which would have been added to the urban population in 2001, were you to sort of do an ex post correction, which the census has never done, and that's fine. It's a consistent methodology. So even today, when you talk about 31.2 being your urbanization rate as per the census, the actual number ex post will most probably be a few percentage points higher. So now, India is more urban than it seems, even by the census's own definition. Now let's look at the broad story of, if you flip the definitions, what happens. And what you find is, this is work that was done, and Kala mentioned this earlier in the morning when she spoke about the difference between China and India. And what this does is basically look at how many people live within hours commute, and they do a little bit of fancy work in trying to figure out the quality of the road network and so on. I'm happy to go into that in details if you want to. But the bottom line is, in 2001, based on the 2001 census data, they figured that in India, 52% of people lived within an hour's commute of a town of 50,000 or more, which, if you remember, is also the American definition of a standard metropolitan statistical area, the SMSA, the smallest SMSA for the US. And in China, that number doesn't budge very much from the official number of 36%. And in India, that number was, remember the official number at that point in time was about 28%. Now it's so it goes up to 52. So by this definition, India is actually way more urbanized than China, right? If I take the other way that we're looking at is something that the person who I am replacing would have told you, Eric Denis, a colleague who works at the IFP in Pondicherry. He and his colleagues have started a project called eGeopolis, which basically plans to map every human settlement on the planet that's more than 10,000 people. They've finished mapping Africa, they've about finished mapping India, and what they find is basically, it's a consistent definition. It also happens to be the French definition, but I'm sure that's coincidental. It basically says that an agglomeration of 10,000 people in a contiguous built-up area, and the contiguity is defined as not more than 200 meters separating two separate built-up areas. Right? So it is, you like it or lump it, but it is a consistent definition being applied across the globe. And what they find that in India, that number in 2001 was about 37%. And most importantly, or rather more, and this is sort of how the difference looks like between the two, the official definition on the left and the agglomeration definition on the right. And the big jump that happens in Bihar, which moves from about 10 to 30. That's because you have a whole bunch of very dense, large villages, or essentially, and these don't meet the census urban criteria. So most of them have a share of male non-agricultural workforce of less than 50%. We check those numbers out, right? So, and then there is commuting, which takes place. And remember, over the last 10 years, one of the big things that did get implemented, and the stuff which is not sort of as slow in its implementation as the JNNURM, is the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, the Prime Minister's Rural Roads Program, which has added over 300,000 kilometers of metal roads across the country, which essentially means that a whole bunch of villages are now way closer to the city in time terms, and therefore it's conceivable there's a lot more commuting back and forth that's taking place, and therefore if you're using these kinds of numbers, you might actually be able to see a lot more people living in villages but being connected to the city. I will point you to a recent piece that came out last year with Avner Greif. Avner is it Berkeley or is he at Stanford? Stanford. So Avner and Guido Tavellini, Avner's always been a sort of a fun sort of stuff to sort of play with. So they looked ahead and figured out the rate of urbanization depending on the strength of kinship ties within societies. And basically the idea being that if you liked your family and like to hang around with them, and sort of, it would take a little longer to sort of skip out and move to the city. And they seem to find, and these kinds of things are always hard to do with the numbers, but they seem to argue that, if you look at the European story, that more or less what happens, where all those, ruthless Germans essentially move to the cities like double quick, and all these nice laid-back, family-oriented Italians sort of take their own sweet time, right? So the fact that Tavellini is Italian, I don't think has anything to do with that fact, but that's a different matter. Right? So the basic takeaway that I like from this particular thing is to say that urban actually may be way more important than what comes out in the census. And why is that important? Because not only are we looking at a lot of economic activity taking place, but there's a lot of stuff that's happening in and around small towns. And one of the more interesting things that happens from a policy point of view is that this is work by Himanshu, Rinku Morgai, Peter Lanjau, and I think there's a couple of other people in there, who basically find, and that's the bottom line of their paper, which says that non-farm diversification is found to occur more rapidly where there is consumption growth in neighboring urban centers, which means that if you have a city nearby, which is where consumption is growing, it changes the pattern of economic activity in nearby villages, and that this relationship is stronger if the center is a smaller town than a city, and that is presumably understandable because presumably the consumption patterns are sort of closer in sort of some kind of metric as opposed to being a consumption pattern of Delhi and a consumption pattern of a village. And therefore the spillovers from this kind of growth towards reduction of even rural poverty is actually quite high. The second thing that we would always like to remember is that in India, there is a larger labor force that is non-farm in the rural areas than in the urban areas. Right? So one of the things that we need to stop thinking about, we want to get out of the equating rural and farm. Right? So that's one dichotomy that I think is useful to break. Then sort of looking at the diversity, what kind of urbanization is taking place, one of the things that sort of comes through is is politics not important? The city where we are in right now, Bangalore, is the only state capital in the country that's actually growing at a rate that's significantly, in a statistical sense, faster than the rest of the state. All the other state capitals, there are some which do, and this is the district wise. So we're not bothering about this whole boundary question of cities and so on. So this is a stable geographical boundary. So it's a singleton capital. Other states have where the state capital is also growing, and a bunch of other places are also growing. But this Karnataka is the only state where its capital is growing as the singleton urban center in some sense, right? And you'll find that districts, including the state capital or districts near the state capital, the periphery story, sort of are such a growth center, means grow much faster in most of the states, or a large number of the states. I don't think there's a majority if you include the northeastern stuff. Right? So that's one question that we need to ask as to where investment gets concentrated, how work gets done, and that kind of story. This is the familiar story of our big towns. I mean, Professor Kundu is familiar of is fond of using the 5 million cutoff as his cutoff, and that sort of gives you the 5 million cities in this place. All except Pune, of course, you'll realize, are all administrative capitals. And across all these places, except for Bangalore, where you see that growing much faster than the periphery, the peripheries of these places are growing, whereas, and this is the slowdown that you talk about, but the slowdown in the core essentially is going much slower than the peripheries in that area. This is the peripheral districts. These are all, we're all doing districts because otherwise you'd run into this whole issue of what your boundary story is, right? So let me just zip across. This just gives you the stuff for Bombay, Delhi and Bombay, and this gives you a sense of what is happening to the distribution of population across sizes, and you find that while the proportion of people in the bigger towns is growing, it's not because the old big towns are growing, the share of their thing is growing, it's because new big towns are showing up. That's the broad stuff that's happening, and that's largely what I'm happy to get back to this later. This is just an SEZ showing that the SEZ is also coming up largely where there are existing urban centers and therefore not alternative centers of urbanization. Finally, the whole question I started off with, which is the issue of, is it because of moving people or morphing places? And what you find that in India, the census towns, these sudden growth in the large number of unacknowledged urbanized places, they account for almost all the urban growth in Kerala, about 2/3 of the urban growth in Bengal. And these numbers are actually estimates, but the numbers that we find, I mean, Chandramouli in his presentation gave an aggregate number which is actually more than this. So the estimate of migration that we have will actually come down. And broadly speaking, the number looks to be about 40%. So of the 90 million people, new urban people that we have got, 40 million are from natural growth, people living in cities giving birth to new people. 20 million is because of people moving from urban to rural to urban areas, and 30 million people are because of the morphing places story, where the character of the settlement changes. You know, that's in terms of broad numbers that we can look at. If anything, there has been some debate about whether or not the census has been pushing urbanization, overestimating the amount of urbanization, and sort of essentially discovering new census towns where there were none. And what we find is actually, if anything, they have been erring on the other side. They're actually not counting enough of them in some sense. Neither are these census towns actually around big towns. It's only about 13%, about less than 1/6 of them are around the really big towns, which is the million-plus cities, and only about 1/3 of them are around in a buffer sense, and this is roughly, I think, a 15-kilometer buffer, which is around the buffers of even 100,000 towns. So this is actually spread out pretty much across the face of the country. But they're not isolated. So if you go back to the earlier stuff that we had done with, I talked about Dennis, when they look at it, a lot of these census towns are part of some such agglomeration that's been part of the story, right? We can get back to, this is what people talked about. Zipping through, are these, Jan Neiman in his work basically says, but yeah, I know that's happening, but these small towns are really a real cesspool, nothing really happens there, there's no activity, and there's not urban. Well, if you look at these numbers, and I remember the last time I presented this, Professor Kundu said, yeah, but the rest of them are just sub-million, therefore pretty large. So this time, and so basically the point from this is that the million-plus cities only make up a fairly small part of what the economic activity of this thing is, and that the structure of the other urban areas is fairly similar. But now if you do this stuff by various size classes of cities, and this is from the recently released census, this is 2011 census numbers, you'll find that there is a fair degree of economic, or at least private assets in pretty small settlements. It varies quite a bit. Basically the point being, this is the point I'll leave for tomorrow when there'll be a session on the subsidies and transfers. If you see the story here, you'll find that the kind of things for which people are talking about cash transfers, kerosene, LPG, etc., they're all sort of stuff that gets consumed in the big towns. The small towns still go around and doing firewood. Unless you figure out some way of doing cash transfers for firewood, we're basically going to be having a nice inverted subsidy regime again. And this just makes the same point in nice little pictures, but across governance things, so we just sort of chucked out all the census towns, the municipal corporations, and everything else, and you find that census towns don't do too badly. So at least on the private kind of asset story, you'll find that census towns obviously worse than the municipal corporations, but not too badly in that sense if you go through these kinds of structures going forward, right? So in conclusion, what you have is that urban A may be more important, and there is, in some sense, I'm sure all these Walton guys are going to jump on me later on, but broadly speaking, this is borrowed from GUA, which is a contribution made by people on their own, and there are a huge number of fairly economically vital small settlements, and therefore, contrary to perception that is urbanization is low, settlements are stagnant, cities are productive. And that's, what does it mean for policy? Is that the focus on the big story, therefore, may actually miss a large part of the urbanization that's actually happening. And much of the non-natural growth seems to be fairly widely spread, which means you need to think about how we're going to service them. Urbanization is not waiting for the state or the corporate sector, whether it's the DMIZs or the Lavasas or whatever you're looking at, and nor are these transforming places very rural in the sense of their consumption patterns or their structures. They look very much like other urban places. So the big question is, how do services and governance respond to the changing character of these settlements? Thank you.
Thank you.